Hey kids, Uncle Clockwork here. So, there's this game that's being played nowadays. It's very popular. And it's been around a while. Uncle Clockwork used to play it back in the day. And he's a little surprised at the amount of popularity that it has gained in the last few years. I mean, it's gone off the charts. I didn't expect it to be this popular. Because back in my day, you know, only the geeks and the nerds were playing it. You know, you kind of got a lot of flack for playing this game. You know, there was a big stigma around it. And you probably guessed by now the game that I'm talking about is Dungeons and Dragons. That's right. Now, the old Uncle Clockwork knows a thing or two about Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. I've played the game a little bit, and I guess you could say that I've been in the game a while. I'm old school. Wait, that's not right. Hold on. As I was saying, I'm old school. Wait, hold on. That's still not right. There we go. I'm real old school. I'm really, really old school. In fact, I'm so old school, my character sheets look like this. So in this little mini-series, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Dungeons & Dragons was like back in the day, back in the 80s, in the golden age of Dungeons & Dragons. It was the first real role-playing game, tabletop role-playing game that kind of hit mainstream, okay? And even back then, it wasn't really mainstream. There was a lot of flack given to people who played Dungeons & Dragons. There was a big stigma around it, especially growing up in the Bible Belt. You know, everyone thought, ooh, you were summoning demons. Ooh, you were a Satanist. Ooh, you were doing evil work. Please. There's math and grammar, a little bit of history. Didn't involve any of that stuff. Yeah, true, there were spells and there were monsters that, referenced these things. But, no more than your average fairy tale or monster movie. I mean, I think the hype was just that. It was hype. People didn't understand it. It was different. What were these kids doing? They were gathering in little groups and going off into dark basements and practicing strange magics. And no, we weren't. We were rolling dice and writing on graph paper. We were painting lead miniatures and, we weren't even getting high off the fumes. We were using acrylic paints. So really, D&D was a little bit different than it is today. Quite different. Nowadays, you go around, saying I play D&D, and everyone's like, "Oh, can I join your group?" So, let me show you a few things that we used back in the day, because some of it's changed, and you might be interested to see exactly what's different. Alright kids, so this right here was your bread and butter for the D&D adventure. This was your character sheet and your dice set. Of course, you would generally have a lot more dice. It was just an addiction. You could never have enough dice. These were basically the character sheets that you would be using, okay? Apologize for the shadow of the camera there, but They had divided it up into thief, assassin, monk, fighter, ranger, paladin, magic user, illusionist, cleric, druid, multi-class bard. All right, and that's what the back of them looked like. Okay. And up here's your dice set. And varying types. One on the far left there is a 10-sider. That's one of the originals from the box set. You got a translucent 4-sider. And then a 12-sider, a 20-sider, and 2 6-siders, of different varieties. The dots and, the actual written numbers. And your ever trusty pencil. That right there is, that's really what you needed. That's all you needed. As a player, at least. Dungeon Master may need a little bit more, but that was it. And there were a few other things, if you wanted to get a little more creative. The original Dungeons & Dragons incorporated figures, little miniatures to help you reference where you were in the game, positioning, order of marching, order of attack, that kind of thing. So, let me show you some of those figures. Okay, so here are some of the original Grenadier lead figures. And apologize for the paint job. These are painted by my 13-year-old hand. I might have been, 14 when I painted these, but 13, 14, somewhere around there. Now these would be what you would be playing with. And a cave fisher and a rust monster, giant slug, a unicorn, cockatrice, shrieker. Got remnants of a skeleton army back here with a mummy, larva, llama. There's a wraith who never stood up. And of course, a couple of dragons. Well, these would be the paints that you would have been using. This is the official Poly-S Fantasy series that was licensed by Dungeons & Dragons. Now, primary colors were, of course, colors of dragons, dragon black, dragon red. You had human flesh. You also had goblin flesh and elf flesh. You had, beholder eye stalk violet and, frost giant ivory. And if you go online and look up, Poly-S Fantasy color series, you can actually find corresponding tables from the current paint series to what they called them back then. So whatever they call red now, you'd have dragon red or mezzademon deep red or rust monster red. It was a pretty extensive paint series actually back in the day. But that's actually what you would have been using. They were acrylic paints, so you could still see them in there. They're a bit dried up. These were sitting in the the back of my cabinet, but along with a few of these. And there you have it. Those are the Grenadier figures that you would have been playing with in the 1980s if you were playing with Dungeons and Dragons. It was either these or Ral Partha, but these were the officially licensed Dungeons and Dragons miniatures. Yeah. And here, kids, is the World of Greyhawk. This is the first official campaign setting released by TSR way back in the day. And if you were playing Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s, you would have been very familiar with it. Many of the modules that were released by TSR took place in the World of Greyhawk, such as the Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. As a matter of fact, there we have the Barrier Peaks. Alright. And of course, you know, I've spent many days and nights campaigning across this land. I know it quite well. From the land of black ice all the way down to the Azure Sea. From the Selenor Ocean all the way to the Sultanate of Zeph. And the sea of dust and the dry steppes. To the bandit kingdoms and the shield lands. Yes, and your dungeon master would be very familiar with this too. He would have known what was going on everywhere. He would have had references, books and such. And if not, he had his imagination, which was his greatest weapon. But he would also have other things like this handy Dungeon Master screen. Give him all the attack and saving throws. We'll give him all the weapon specs and turntables for clerics. And you, as a player, you would only see this. Of course, I stared at a slightly different screen, but all the data was the same. So there you have it. The World of Greyhawk. But there's a lot more. Now, if you were playing Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s, you would have had a bunch of these. These are the original campaign modules that were produced by TSR, or at least a handful of them. The ones that I have, at least. Now, you can see that there's a progression here. Some of the older ones are in solid colors, and then of course by 1982 they had moved on to the new format with the orange spines. But these are self-contained adventures. Some of them are serials. You know, you'll play one and then you'll play another and another, 2 or 3 at a, in succession. But most of these are just single one-shot, adventures that you would play over the course of a weekend or a tournament. Some of these would actually be played in tournament. And how you would play them in tournament is that you would show up to the convention, you would be assigned a character, and then your score in the tournament would be based upon your ability to play that character within the dungeon that was provided. Back at Gen Con, they would use that as a playtesting field for some of the modules that they would eventually release. So, and I'll crack one open here in a second and show you what's in it. I don't want to go through them all. I may start a series where I introduce you to a single module one at a time, but I'll show you what's inside at least one of these, and then maybe give you a rundown of some of my favorites. Okay, since I'd already mentioned the Barrier Peaks, I thought I'd whip that one out. This is Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, TSR Dungeon Module S3, part of the S series. These were high-level modules written by the man himself, Gary Gygax. Now this one was actually one of my favorites because this involved a crashed spaceship. It was a weird crossover where you blended fantasy with science fiction. You were fantasy characters sent to investigate basically a crashed spaceship. Now, the modules themselves would have, of course, the nice cover art, and usually on the interior side you would have maps. All right, with all the detail and glossaries and keys that you would need to play the adventure. All the rooms numbered or lettered. And of course, on the back we have a listing of the other modules that were available at the time. Now, the module itself, of course, would be, nice, a nice Errol Otis artwork from 1983. His artwork permeates the modules at that time. That was before Elmore and Caldwell and Easley and Parkinson took over. So, but as you see, it's basically just written up. Each room is numbered and corresponds with a number on the map. Players would enter the room. You'd read off the small description, and then they would deal with whatever's in the room, traps or monsters or as such. Now, usually in the back of the module, there would be other tables, reference material, appendices. There would be any additional monsters that were created for the module itself. And there would also be any additional equipment or magic items that were found exclusively in this dungeon. So. Well, it was like this one because, if you were lucky, you got to load up on some high-tech weapons. If you didn't have the power cells to power, it didn't matter, but if you did, it could be fun. Alright. Now this one and a few others did come with a special separate booklet. Most of these only come with just the cover maps and the interior descriptions. This one actually came with some illustrations, an illustration booklet that would show you exactly what you were facing. Of course, numbers corresponding to numbers in the descriptions to actually, show you what you were facing, as opposed to just having the Dungeon Master describe it to you. So, there you go. Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. That's just one of many modules that you could possibly play back in the 80s. Now, as I said, back in the 80s, my brother introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons, and he did so in a very interesting way. I was still probably about 10 or 11 years old, and, kind of, coming into puberty, but still had very much a child mindset. And there was a movie coming on that I wanted to see. I believe it was Race for Your Life, Charlie Brown. And my brother had some time on his hands that evening, and he pulled me aside and he said, well, you can be a kid if you want to and watch that cartoon. Or you can be a big boy like us. Play the big boy game, Dungeons & Dragons. You want to learn how? You watch the cartoon and be a kid. Be a man. Play Dungeons & Dragons. Well, duh. Preteen Heath, yeah. Your old Uncle Clockwork jumped on that. So he sat me down, laid it on the line for me. And the way he did it was very interesting, because both of us had just recently seen a movie. This was in 1981. and John Boorman's Excalibur had just come on the scene. All right. Now, my brother got to see it in the theater. He saw the R-rated version of it. He was old enough to see it at that time. Well, they came out with a PG version and released it on HBO, and I got a chance to see that one. And I loved it. You know, the old classic Arthur tale. Well, when he introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons, he grabbed this book. Deities and Demigods. And then he flipped it to this page. Arthurian Heroes. And there, before me, were all the characters I had just watched in the movie. Arthur and Merlin, Morgan Le Fay, Mordred. But they were all written up with these stats. And he began to explain them to me. How, you know, what meant what the numbers meant, you know, what their equipment was, how that worked, what the armor was, how that worked. And I just got hooked. So of course, if you were playing D&D in the 80s, you know, you naturally would have had a Deities and Demigods, and you would have been checking out the things that were in it, like the Arthurian myths and Excalibur. But there was something a little weird going on with the Deities and Demigods at that time. Because, well, TSR didn't quite get the licensing for a couple of things they put in their first edition. So a few of us got lucky and got a first edition that had references to H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu myths and the works of Michael Moorcock and Elric. Well, this isn't one of those. I did have one of those, and I think it's actually in the care of my brother right now. But I have the books that they reference, and that would have been something that you would have been very interested in playing in the 80s. I had to pull out my big honkin' H.P. Lovecraft book. This is all of his collected works. This is a more recent book, purchased at Barnes & Noble. I don't know, I got it on sale for like $15, really. But I've had all of his work in paperback form or another throughout the years. But you definitely would have been reading some H.P. Lovecraft back in the day, play some D&D. It would have certainly given you that otherworldly feel of, especially if you were playing things like Queen of the Demon Web Pits and you had to go to the abyss and fight demons. So H.P. Lovecraft would have been on your reading list. And of course, as I said, Michael Moorcock and his Elric series, that also would have been on your radar. If you'd had the first edition of Deities and Demigods, then you certainly would have picked this up. And this is straight up swords and sorcery. So of course, these were some of the books that actually influenced the game and its writers. Now someone else that would be in the Deities and Demigods would have been Fritz Leiber and his Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser series. Again, these were also influential in creating the game. You know, earned themselves a whole pantheon. And later on, mid-80s, TSR actually got full licensing and went ahead and created a campaign setting from the city of Lankhmar, which is the major city in which these adventures take place. Now finally in this installment of Dungeons & Dragons 80s style, I'm going to leave you with this. And see if you could find some of these, especially if you have kids, young adults. They would really like this. Pre-teens, you know, early teens. I think they really get into this series. This is the Endless Quest series by Rose Estes. These were officially licensed Dungeons & Dragons choose-your-own-adventure novels. You know, they're pretty short. You know, not much to them. And there's a lot more of them than just this small collection. These are just the ones that I managed to hold on to over the years. You probably got about a dozen or so. But I recommend this series because it, especially, like I said, if you've got young kids you're trying to introduce to the game, this would certainly get them in the mood and give them the idea about what role-playing is. You know, choices you have to make, decisions and such. You know, you're faced with problems, you're faced with, you know, conflict. Do you want to fight this guy? Do you want to run? That kind of thing. So, you know, good books to have to understand the game itself. So that's it for this installment, kids, of Dungeons & Dragons 80s style. I'll probably make a few more videos in this series because I want to show you some of the modules and some of the other materials that we might have used to gain inspiration when we played Dungeons and Dragons. We didn't have all the fancy, you know, Lord of the Rings movies and you know, Game of Thrones and Witcher TV series that you guys have nowadays. We had to pull our inspiration from elsewhere. So maybe I'll show you a few of those things too. That's it for now, kids. That's Uncle Clockwork, clocking out. We'll see you next time.